John.
Okay.
Take your Bibles, turn to in your Bibles to the book of John, chapter 21. John, chapter 21.
Oh, I got glasses. I can do this.
Let me reset my
I was starting to think I didn't have the book of John on my Bible.
tablet here.
Well, that's pretty bad then.
I have glasses now. I do that.
I'm sure it's in
I
there.
don't know. Can you guys hear me okay? Did she turn that on?
No, it's not. You're not recording. Are you recording?
Mm-hmm. It should be. I turned it on live, but
All right, I can see you on the screen there.
well, that's good. But are you hearing me through this? That's the thing. Anyway, let's pray before we get started. Heavenly Father, we come before you now, Lord, and we just thank you for our time to be together. We just thank you for what you've done for us, what you're going to do. We just praise your name in all that we do. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Well, I just messed up my notes. Redo this. There we go. Touch some of the buttons there.
Spiritual attack, spiritual attack.
Huh?
I said spiritual attack right out of the gate.
No. Operator error. Touching buttons you shouldn't be touching.
Oh,
Well, you have the out right there. Yeah.
Nah, I'm willing to admit when I do the wrong thing there. Today we're going to talk about Peter's restoration, but it's also a time. If you look at the timeline here, this is a time of anxiety, a time of not understanding, a time of uncertainty, a time of they're not relying on Jesus for the disciples. They're trying to figure things out. They're trying to see what's going on. Just like where we are right now, just about. Okay? Because this is a time when there's a lot of anxiety going on. There's a lot of things happening. There's things that we don't understand. There's uncertainty. This is even a time when the disciples have kind of lost their faith. And I've had to deal with some people this week and last week who they're questioning their faith. Wondering, what's going on? What's happening? How come why is God not just destroying this and taking care of it? Where is your faith at? And this is where the disciples are at this time. The 11 are trying to figure out what's going on. What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? How am I supposed to handle this? And it comes down to God restoring even Peter. Here we'll see it's mainly he's focusing on Peter's faith and Peter's love. And that's where God can be with us. He wants to restore our faith, restore love into our life, restore the things that we've lost. And this is what we see in this chapter. This is after the death of Christ. This is after the resurrection. The disciples have been told to go to Galilee. That's the setup for the story here. They've seen Jesus twice now. They were in the upper room. They were hiding. He came through the door that was closed. They were locked up. And they saw him. They've seen the empty tomb. They've seen all those things. And their faith should be restored, but they're still trying to figure it out. And they're still on shaky ground because they're relying on themselves. They're looking to themselves for their inner strength. And that's kind of where we are as Americans. We believe in the pull yourself up by your own bootstraps theory, right? We're independent. We want to take care of ourselves. Well, at least the majority, well, not even the majority anymore, but that's the way it should be. Is that's the American stock is we take care of ourselves. I don't need somebody to hold my hand. I can take care of myself. And then we run into things like this, and our faith gets shook a little bit. And some people, it gets shook a lot.
oh yeah.
You know, and this is where the disciples are. Their faith is shook. It's been restored a little bit, seeing Jesus those 2 times, but Peter's still in a funk. He's still trying to figure things out. He's still trying to get past his guilt and shame and all those things for denying Christ 3 times. That he didn't keep his word. He's got all this inside him right now. And we're going to see that he just falls back on his old self. on what he used to do. And this is where the disciples are. This is what they're doing. We're going to look at chapter 21 today. We're not going to read it all at one time. We're going to take it in chunks and spaces there. But this is where the disciples are right now. And we'll see verses 1 through 8 here. We'll start out with them. John chapter 21. So after these things, so this is after the death of Christ, after the resurrection, after they've seen Jesus at least twice here. It says, after these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and in this way he showed himself. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. Verse 3, Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. They said to him, we're going with you. They went out, and immediately they got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, children, have you any food? They answered him, no. And he said to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land, but about 200 cubits, dragging the net with fish. How many of you have seen the phrase or heard the phrase, or even said the phrase to yourself, do something even if it's wrong? You know, we find that out, we see that a lot. Do you remember the old Popeye cartoons? Olive Oyl would get herself in a mess. And she would want Popeye to figure it out and to get her out of it. She'd say, do something, Popeye. And he would eat his spinach, get all strong, and do whatever he needed to do to fix the problem. And that's kind of where we're at even a little bit today. What we see there is that we need to do something. Okay? And when we're in our houses, kind of like now, and not be able to go do things like we used to, not go out to eat, not go to the park, not do these things that we socialize with people. Because there's people out there, you know, there's people who, this is their way of life all the time. They kind of like it. And then there's other people who, I got a friend at work, he likes to hug people.
I'm missing that.
And man, he can't hug nobody, he's about to die. You know? And I tease him about that a little bit. And there's people that are that way. And they just want to do something. And that's what disciples are here. They decide they're just going to do something. Like I said before, Peter's in a funk. He's trying to figure things out. He feels guilty. He has shame built upon him. And it's not that Jesus put the shame on him. He's put that shame on himself and that guilt. And he's reliving in his mind his faults. Have you ever found yourself doing that? I mean, I have quite a few times where I think about the things I do wrong. And I get into this thing of where I'm in shame and guilt and I just keep wallowing in it and keep wallowing in it. This is where Peter's at. He's decided that, you know what? I don't care. And now I'm going fishing. He's going back to what he knew. I mean, I've been there with that. We've had trouble with the last one of the churches we were at when we lived in Placerville, and I had those people who kind of, I felt, stabbed me in the back and did those things. And I got to the point where, you know what, I'm not going to school, I'm not going to church no more. I'm going to go back to, because somebody had come to me and asked me to coach the high school soccer team. And I'm going, you know what? Talked to my wife and I said, I'm coaching soccer. Something that I knew before, something that's comforting for me, something that I'm solid on, something that I can do really well on my own. And this is where Peter's at. Fishing for him is this thing he can do, and nobody has to tell him how to do it. He just does it. Because it's in his blood, it's in his thing, and it's comforting. It gets him out of this feeling of this guilt and shame, and it just keeps rolling around in his life. But it's futility for him right now. Because you know why? He didn't ask God what God wanted him to do. When we had that problem, and when I decided, you know what, I'm not going to church no more, I'm going to start doing soccer, I didn't pray about it. I didn't ask God what He wanted me to do. I just said, I'm done. And this is where Peter is at. And you know what? He's being the leader. He says, I'm going fishing. All these other disciples start following. because they're doing something, even if it's wrong. They've decided to do this. And it becomes an act of futility for them. They didn't wait on God's leading. Jesus told them, go to Galilee and I'll meet you there. And we see that earlier in some other chapters and stuff. And they went to Galilee, and they're going, I don't see Jesus. So Peter says, I'm going fishing. I'm going back to what I know to do. Going back to something that gives me the comfort that I need. And when we find ourselves nowadays in the house and we're doing things and we're not able to do those other things and we're feeling that anxiety and those things, so we try to do something that maybe gets us in that zone where we know that it may not be the right thing to do, we're going to do it anyway. And our faith starts lacking. And this is where we see the disciples at. And the futility of what they're doing. They didn't wait on God's leading. They didn't see what God wanted them to do. They didn't know. They just decided to go do what they were going to do. It's possible the men relied too much on their previous experiences, their previous training. Peter himself was there, and as was James and John, plus Thomas and Nathaniel. There's two others who weren't named. They were despondent at this time. They had seen Jesus come back to life. He told them to go to Galilee, and they went, but they didn't know what to do from there. And they didn't wait to see what God wanted from them. They went back to their old routine. Not that it was a sin, but that it was something that was comfortable, and they didn't have to wait on God no more. They were doing something. You would think that when they saw Jesus on the shore, and he tells them to throw it on the other side, they would remember what had happened before back in Luke chapter 5. Where they'd worked hard all night and didn't get anything, but Jesus says if you try it on the other side, you'll get something in it. And if you remember that story, it was so bad they had to call another boat in, and the nets were breaking because they had caught so much fish. And that's a miracle there. And they should have realized this is Jesus, and they didn't really do it until all of a sudden their nets are starting to bulge. And they begin to sink. They received nothing for their efforts that night, here in John chapter 21, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. Again, they caught no fish. Maybe there are times when the Lord speaks to us, not only in our successes, but also in our failures. The times when people are cheering for us, rejoicing in the good things, the accolades, the attaboys, but sadly you might well drown out the voice of the Lord when we're getting those cheers. When we don't have those praises, when we don't have those cheers and noise from the crowds, then we hear the Lord's voice clearer than before. I read a pastor's take on this passage when I was developing this, or looking at what I wanted to do here. And he said this: I remember preaching a message based on this text a few years ago. I made mention that sometimes we hang on to programs and strategies that aren't working, and simply mentioned that any program used without God's blessing would be about as effective as a broken coffee cup. He goes on to say, needless to say, several people took issue with this almost immediately and promptly began to send the nonverbal messages the pastor's way. Now, a pastor can tell when people are starting to get irritated by his message because they'll start doing this. Then you'll get this. And I've preached some sermons not here. Well, if I did, I wouldn't tell you to be here. But I've preached sermons places where I can tell people are getting mad. And God is stepping on their toes, not me. They think it's me. They think I'm attacking them personally. But it's like, I'm preaching God's word. And they get this going.
You gotta be kidding.
They get the frown going. And they get all that going. And this is what's happened to this pastor. And he can see those things happening. He goes on to say, needless to say, I was never invited back to that church. The idea was simply to show that when we do things our own way, without God's blessing, we dare not expect much in the way of results. That's what these 11 disciples discovered during this wasted night. There was no results for them. When we start doing things our way, And this is the way it is right now for you. And you got to think about this. We're in a place where we're able to do what we want to do, go do the things we want to do, how we want to do it, and now we're restricted on what we got to do. And we don't want to rely on God and use this restriction in such a way that it presents God in a good light or presents God to people. There's ways that we can do it, and we just have to look for those ways. Are we waiting on God to open doors for us and see that? The disciples, they weren't waiting for God. They didn't wait on Jesus. They showed up, he wasn't there, we're going to do our own thing. And it became a night of futility, a night of nothing happening. They did something that was wrong. Sometimes we have to take that breath and take that step back and ask ourselves, what does God want us to do in this situation? We have those, we get those anxiety when we're at home, like we were talking about earlier. Maybe take a step back and pray. God, how can we fix it? The songs we sang earlier, God will make a way. He will. When there seems to be no way out, God will make a way. And a lot of times it's not going to. And we have to rely on God and hear Christ's voice. And that's what they finally did. They heard Christ's voice there in verse 5. And Jesus said to them, children, have you any food? They answered him and said, no. And he said to them, cast the net on the right side, and you will find some. Hey, God's going to find some stuff for us and some ways to do the things we need to do. That grace that he gives us to have grace for other people. It may be that it's just a matter of us showing our family members that we're stuck in house with the grace that God's given us. Not having the impatience, not having the yelling at, but having that grace that God gave to us. Even when we did the wrong thing. And we can restore to them peace that they need. And showing that. And this is what Jesus is trying to bring across here to these disciples. Now these men are tired, they're hungry, they're trying to figure things out. And all of a sudden Jesus says, throw it on the other side. What's amazing here is they do that, they start bringing it in. And what I find, again, amazing at this point is verse 7. Now therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved, you all know who that was, right? That's John. It's amazing how John brings that out here in his book. I don't know if there's a little pride there, if it's just a little, hey, Peter, the disciple Jesus loved. But he says that the disciple Jesus loved, he leans over to Peter as they're pulling the nets up, and he says, hey, that's Jesus. And Peter, I love Peter. He lets go of the net, and what does he do? He jumps overboard.
I couldn't figure that out.
He jumps overboard, and he's swimming to land. He's not waiting. He realizes that Jesus is there, and he wants to restore fellowship with him. He wants that relationship back that Peter did destroy. And Jesus is there, looking for Peter. And I want to bring it out a little bit later on, but I want to talk about here is what is amazing is that we see is Jesus is looking for Peter. Peter wasn't looking for Jesus. That's why John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, had to go, hey, dude, that's Jesus. It didn't dawn on Peter that's who it was, because Peter wasn't looking for him like he should have been. And us as Christians, when a lot of times in our life, we're not looking for Jesus in everything that we do. When we should be looking for him every step of the way. When we sing, "It is well with my soul," it's because we know that Jesus is in control, that God is in control, and that he is in control of our life, and that no matter what comes, he still has control of my soul. He still has me. And we can sing, "It is well with my soul." Those are the things that the disciples had lost in this time period. And then in verses 9 through 14, we see Jesus provides for them. Let's read that. Then as soon as they had come to land, and they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid in it, and bread, Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have caught." Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land, full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not broken. Well, that's got to be an amazing thing, setting many fish coming in and the net's not breaking. I mean, that's another miracle that Jesus provided there. Jesus said to them, "Come and eat breakfast." Yet none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" knowing that it was the Lord. I like that verse. Jesus says, "Come on and eat." And they're like, "We're not going to ask who this is because we know this is God. This is Jesus. This is the person that we were supposed to be looking for, and we decided to go fishing." I imagine that this is Pastor Larry's thought here. I imagine they're a little ashamed of themselves because they weren't looking for Jesus. They were looking out for themselves. And they're kind of sheepish as they're coming to the fire. Verse 13, Jesus said to them, Jesus then came and took the bread and gave it to them, likewise the fish. This is now the third time Jesus showed himself to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. We need not forget that Jesus, being God in human flesh, knows exactly what it is like to be hungry, cold, and tired, and so on. These men had been on the sea all night, apparently nothing to show for it. And you can relate with them. They've been out on the sea, they've been out in this boat, waves crashing over the edge, trying to get the fish in, and they're tired, they're hungry, they want to get food, and they're trying to figure out. Now, since they had no catch and nothing for their laborers, they obviously had nothing to eat either. There was no supermarkets there, not even a convenience store. You couldn't go to the 7-Eleven and get a piece of jerky and a soda. They had to rely on what they caught in order to eat. They had no food. They weren't going to eat. But all of a sudden they see Jesus with this fire, and he's cooked some fish for them. He had fish and bread by the fire. He encouraged the disciples to bring some more of the fish up that they had caught. Just moments before, it seems, the disciples heard the voice of Jesus telling them to throw the net on the right side of the boat, and they would catch it. They certainly did. It's interesting, too, the nets didn't break at this time. There was that 153 fish. In Luke 5, if you remember that, the nets were about to break, and they had to call somebody else in to help get it. John was careful to add that detail that the nets weren't going to break after they had 153 large fish. Not just small fish, 153 large fish. And because of the other two occasions when Jesus fed the multitudes, once 5,000, another time 4,000, he used sardines to feed those, if you remember that. And now they're talking about large fish. God provided. And that's what we have to remember, right? When we're going through times of need and times when we're looking for Jesus and there are things that we just don't know what's going to happen and we're struggling, that Jesus provides. He makes that way. He makes that preservation for us. He provided for these men. And you notice that there was a charcoal fire. This could be quite similar to the last time that Peter had been near a charcoal fire. Remember that? The night of Jesus' death, when he betrayed Jesus 3 times. He wound up in the midst of God's enemies. Jesus didn't have to say a word to Peter. Peter must have gotten the message loud and clear. The major difference was this welcoming fire is to help fellowship with Jesus. He wasn't hanging out with Jesus' enemies anymore. Dr. Oliver Green, on one of his radio messages, said something like this: if you have to warm your feet by the devil's fire, then freeze for Jesus. What fellowship really and what business did Peter have warming himself near the enemies of Jesus? But now here's a fire with fish and bread, reminding the disciples that the times when Jesus provided for those in need. Isn't it great how God reminds us and gives us this little reminders of what He's done in the past that He will provide for in the future? A lot of times we get stuck in the present and we're wondering what's going to happen and how is this going to get through? What are we going to do? And we forget God's provided it for us in the past.
Mhm.
And that's when our faith gets shaken because we're so focused on the right now, here, right in front of us, that we forget what happened. We need to take those blinders off of being in the present and rely on Christ and realize that He provides for us. And that will strengthen your faith. When we remember those things. In that culture they were having that fellowship time, meal times weren't so much about the food as they were about the fellowship. It was an intimate time when the group or family would take some time and enjoy the company as well as the cooking. And Jesus is bringing the disciples in close, and they're having again that time of fellowship, that time of showing that God provides. And it's an intimate time. It's a close time. You know, one of the things that even psychologists talk about is that the importance of family dinner around the table. And how that helps children realize that parents are involved in their life. And I don't have the statistics in front of me, but there's statistics that show when you do that, how much more the kids are developing better, and how much more they cope with things when you have that time together. God wants us to have that fellowship with Him. He wants us to have that intimate time, that Bible study, that devotional time, that prayer time that strengthens our faith. That puts us in a place where we should be. And then verses 15 through 25, we're going to see that Jesus kind of gives a look into the future for Peter. After this fellowship meal, there's still something that's not quite right. Simon Peter's probably still has never asked Jesus for forgiveness for that night. He's still in his shame and guilt. He might have taken Peter aside or speaking in low tones so that Peter alone could hear. He wasn't looking to humiliate Peter in front of everybody. He wanted that restoration and bring Peter back into the fold. He was going to rebuke Peter, but he was also going to restore him. Verses 15 through 17 says this. So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonas, do you love me more than these? He said to him, this is Peter, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, feed my lambs, Jesus saying to Peter. He said to him again, Jesus said to him again a second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And Peter says to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus says to him, tend my sheep. Then Jesus says to him a third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he had said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know of all things, that you know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. What I want us to see here, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, is that Jesus came to Peter. That's amazing to really think about. Peter ran away from Jesus, didn't he? Peter did the wrong thing. And we don't see Peter turning to Christ and trying to get that forgiveness and that thing restored. We see God coming to Peter and restoring that fellowship. Think about that in your own life. When there are times that you've done something that you know has been wrong against God, you know that's been the wrong thing to do, and yet God's trying to get to you to restore you back to fellowship. I think that's a great idea of us to look at. He wants to restore us. He doesn't want to just leave us out in the cold. He wants to bring us back in. He wants to put His arms around us. He's there to restore you. Peter wasn't looking for God. Peter was going back to what he knew and what was comfortable. But Jesus was looking for him. Something we miss in our English translations is the different words of love here that's in the original Greek. Jesus used the word for agape, which means an unconditional love. And when Peter responds, what he does is he's saying, well, I like you like a friend. And Jesus is saying, do you love me unconditionally? How much do you love me, Peter? And Peter's response is very weak. Not very fond of you. Think about that. If you're in a romantic relationship and the one person says, I love you so much, and the other person says, well, I'm really fond of you. You know, wives, you wouldn't want your husband to say that I'm really fond of you. Husbands, you wouldn't want your wife to say, I kind of like you.
I love peanuts.
He wants that love, and this is what Jesus is trying to get across to Peter is that it's unconditional love. See, that Jesus is trying to get Peter to understand that he must love Jesus in that way, that unconditional way, in order to be a leader that God is calling him to be. The third time Jesus asked, do you love me? In John 21:17, he uses that word again, and Peter finally responds, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. The point in the different Greek words for love sees that Jesus is stretching Peter to moving from that fondness to that unconditional love. When we love Jesus unconditionally, what happens is our faith becomes strong and we realize that He's in control. You know, a wife that loves her husband realizes that she's safe with him and that she can trust him and that he's going to lead in the way that God wants you to lead. Now, husbands are human. They make mistakes.
Yeah.
You know? And we do the wrong thing. We let emotions get in the way. We let other things get in the way. And that's the things that we have to realize, that we got to come back like Peter did. Or like Jesus wants to restore us. That He's there to restore us back to where we need to be. Showing that unconditional love for God. A lot of times when husbands make those mistakes, make those things wrong, is because they've forgotten that unconditional love for Jesus. And this is what Peter did, doing the wrong thing. Verses 18 and 19, we see a revelation of Peter, a future prophecy almost. Verse 18 says this, most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. Peter certainly was no stranger to death. Seen Jesus die and others. Sure, he knew that he wasn't going to live forever. But here is Christ telling him how he's going to die. And then I like that part of verse 19. He says, follow me. Think about that. Jesus is telling you how you're going to die, and he says, follow me. It means you got a choice here, Peter. You can follow me and fulfill that prophecy of what's going to happen to you, or you can try and run away. You can be Jonah, and you can be Peter. Jonah ran away from God and finally had to go do what God wanted him to do. Peter has almost a choice here. And Jesus is telling him, hey, this is what's going to happen to you. This is what's going to be your life. You will die a horrible death, basically. But I want you to follow me anyway. And this is where we are at, Christians, right nowadays, is that our faith can be shaken. Our faith can be on shaky ground, what we think is shaky ground, because we've allowed it to be shaky ground. But our faith is built into Jesus, and He's telling you, follow me anyway. Trust me. When someone says, follow me, they're telling you, trust me. And Jesus is telling Peter, trust me. I have what's best for you in mind. And we know that later on, Peter went on to be this man of God, that his faith was unshaken, and that he did die a horrible death. He died on a cross upside down. He was led to that. And that's what this verse is telling you. In Peter's 2 letters to epistles that he has written, he knew the day of his death was coming, but he was prepared for that day when it was coming. Jesus had told him about that. But then we come to verses 20 through 25, and we see Peter's rebuke here. Peter turning around saw the disciple whom Jesus loved. Again, that's John. Following, who also had leaned on his breast at the supper table. This is why we know that it's John. And said, Lord, who is the one who betrays you? Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, "But Lord, what about this man?" Here's Jesus' rebuke. Jesus said to him, "If I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? You follow me." Then this saying went out among the brethren that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die. But if I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who testifies to these things and wrote these things. We know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things that Jesus did, which if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Amen. What we see here is Peter realizing he's going to die. He hasn't answered Jesus yet, and he's trying to deflect that question and not bring that answer in right now. So he looks around and sees John. Well, what about him? Have you ever seen that, especially in kids?
Oh, yeah.
One time when I was working undercover security down in San Francisco, these young kids came in, and they were really young, and they had stolen some things. And I walked out on with them, and I showed them my badge. One of them looked back at me, and we were outside the store, and I showed him my badge. And the kid looked at me and went, "Well, he did it too." And that's what's happening here. Peter is trying to get this deflected off him. Well, what's going to happen to him? You're telling me something really bad I don't want to know about. And then you want me to follow you. What about this guy? And Jesus is basically telling him here, in Pastor Larry's paraphrase, is mind your own business. If it's my will that he stays alive until I come again, what is that to you? You follow me. Jesus is bringing him to a point that he has to make a choice. And that's what it comes down to us as Christians. Yeah, Peter's been rebuked. Peter has been restored. But Peter's also been rebuked here. Hey, dude, concentrate on yourself. This is where all that gossiping, all that thing about, let's have a prayer request about this person because, they're doing something really bad. We need to pray for them. Hey, focus on yourself. Focus on what God has for you, and you follow Christ. This is what Jesus is telling Peter. I don't care. You shouldn't care what happens to John. I want you to follow me. And as a Christian, we have to realize that we shouldn't care what happens to everybody else, that we need to follow Christ. Look to him to be your leader and follow God. As a Christian, at this time in our lives, this time of even in the world, our faiths can be shaken. We can be wondering what's going on. But we have to concentrate on following God. You follow me. That's what Jesus is saying. Your faith is shaken, guess what? Follow me. Realize what I've done for you in the past, and realize that will help strengthen your faith. But still follow me. No matter what's going to happen, follow me. Follow Jesus. We see this glimpse into Peter. We see the restoration of Peter. And we can see in for our own lives, the restoration of ourselves. This is a time when we could be that shaken person wondering what's going to happen. And we can be restored to fellowship with Christ. Are you following Jesus? You want your faith strengthened up? Follow God. Remember what he's done for you in the past. Let him restore you. Do you love him? If you do, feed his sheep. How much do you love him? And if you love him that much, follow him. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for what you've done for us, Lord. Thank you for what you're going to do. Pray that you just guide and direct us. Help us to continually to follow you. In Jesus' name, amen.